series, providing you with timely information and training each month on topics of interest. This is Diane Powers, Vice President for Professional Development and Education. This month we are presenting Rev Up Your Referrals. With me today are Joe Templin of Unique Minds Consulting Group and Matt Anderson of the Referral Authority. Both these men and NAIFA members have extensive experience serving the insurance and financial services industry as speakers, consultants, trainers, and authors of best-selling books that address practices to help you grow your business. So let's begin. Joe, I'll turn the discussion to you.
Thank you, Diane. And I hope everybody's got your pen and paper so that you can take some notes and walk away with a couple of real ideas that you can actually utilize today to help rev up your business. Next slide, please, Diane. So what we're going to be talking about today is dollars ex machina. And really what it comes down to is you need to look at your business as if it were a machine. A machine systematically produces the results that you want. If you do it right, it should literally be printing money as long as you're doing the right thing. And the raw material of your machine, next slide please, Diane, is what Graham called qualified suspects. Right? Is it any that you think is worth pursuing to take through your financial planning or advising or sales process, however you want to call it. Next slide, please. Okay. I, however, don't like the qualified suspect verbiage simply because if you go up to one of your clients and say, hey, can you introduce me to a couple of qualified suspects, they're going to look at you like you're some sort of cop or something and want to hand you a donut. Okay. It is just a phrase that does not resonate properly in American society today. So I actually prefer the term introduction, which, as dictionary.com says, is a formal personal presentation of one person to another or other. This is literally the individual turning you over to their friend, Joe, I want you to meet my friend so-and-so, and there is a handshake involved, which is literally the start of our entire sales process. And there's a definition versus connotation here. Diane, next slide, please. So one of the things I want you to do is eliminate from your vocabulary suspect or referral, because referral still has got a negative connotation over the past couple of decades. So ask people for introductions. Tell people I work strictly on an introductory basis. Talk about being introduced to people, because that's what normal people do. Don't speak like an insurance agent. Don't speak like a financial planner. Speak like a normal person. So there's 4 things I want to really go over today. They're the basic concepts of how I built my business. And I was 100-plus lives a year writer every single year, perennial MDRT a couple of years, much, much higher than that. You know, I built a very strong management practice in terms of recruiting and developing young investors. These are the 4 concepts that you really need to understand and convey to yourself and to your clients. Capitalism, calculating and understanding your values, the law of large numbers, and the SOP, which is standard operating procedures. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've got the real definition of capitalism, which is exchange of wealth made and maintained, blah, 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 blah. But the working definition that I utilize is a system of free exchange of items or services of value or profit. There's a couple of key things in this. Free exchange, value, and profit. Okay? What free exchange means is that the government's not forcing somebody to buy insurance from you. If they did, it would be a lot easier and we wouldn't make the money that we potentially can. Okay? The client is free to not follow your advice. Even though your advice might be the absolute best thing in the world and will completely solve all their problems, they can choose to be stupid and not follow. You also can choose not to accept somebody as a client. If somebody is just a plain jerk, you can reject accepting them. And that's something that you need to understand and start doing at some point, is turning away people who are jerks, turning away people who are headaches, because you are too valuable, you do too much good, and you do not need that headache and that hassle. Okay? And value and profit, very, very important. You need to make sure that you and your client both understand that your service is valuable. If they do not value you as a person, it's going to be 9 o'clock at night and you're going to be chasing people to try and get signatures, or sitting down at their table at 4 4 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock at night, and the kid's going to be puking on you, and they're not going to appreciate you and the service that you provide. So you have to realize that you are valuable. You have to talk about that value and get the clients to believe that. Profit, they get something out of it, you get something out of it. You both feel good about it in the end. Next slide, please. So here's a couple of things. In your approach, when you first sit down with a potential client, you need to discuss compensation right away. They need to understand how you get paid. One of the things that I found that works incredibly well in the business owner community, or if you're working with professionals, is ask them straight out, are you a capitalist? I am. You know, do you believe in the free exchange of goods and services? And they'll either tell you, yes, I do, especially if they're in business for themselves, or they'll tell you no. If they say, I'm a socialist. If they're a socialist, by the way, you're probably not going to get them to buy life insurance or save money for the future. So it's good to know that in the first minute of your conversation with them, so that you don't literally waste your time doing free consulting. Okay? Once they say, yes, I am a capitalist, then you can have a discussion based on a mutual belief system. You know, as a fellow capitalist, do you believe that your time is valuable? Do you believe that you should be paid for the good work that you do? It doesn't matter if the guy turns wrenches for a living or if he's an attorney and he's writing documents. Okay? As long as they're capitalists and they believe that their time is valuable, you need to impress upon them that your time is also valuable, and you can have a mutual understanding and discussion. And this is very important because if they don't value you, they're not going to appreciate you, and you're not going to have the basis of a successful relationship. Okay? But they do believe you, they do value you, and you start laying this groundwork immediately, you can have good conversations and long-range, good professional relationships. Another thing that you should do is anybody that's a white-collar professional, primarily attorneys, but also accountants, doctors, consultants, ask them, are you familiar with the term pro bono? Okay? Are you familiar with the idea of doing free work for charity to help people who can't afford it? And they'll say yes or no, and you can talk about it for a couple minutes and just tell them flat out. I believe in pro bono work, but if I do only pro bono, I can't afford to stay in business. I do good quality work. I am a valued professional, and as such, I need to be compensated for my time. The way that I choose to be compensated is when you go into that discussion of being introduced to other quality individuals like themselves, like you were introduced to them by Dr. Umstetter or somebody like that. So if they can see that this is part of your process, that this is how you work and choose to be compensated, they have a greater understanding of it. And if you lay that groundwork up front and ask them, if you find value in what we do you agree to introduce me to other individuals just like so-and-so introduced us? They say, yes, I agree to do that. You now have a verbal contract that is not legally binding, but is psychologically binding with them. And if you get them to that at the end of your meeting, admit, yes, you create value, and two, they remember making the promise to introduce you to other individuals, getting introductions is going to be a very easy thing at that point. So always, always, always discuss compensation up front. People don't mind talking about it as long as you don't spring it on them. Next slide, please. So that's one thing, doing it up front. Another thing is, even before you get into the meetings, you have to understand that you are valuable. Because if you're trying to convey to another individual that you have value, you have to believe that beforehand. So every single one of you should do a quick calculation. What are you worth per hour? Is it $40 an hour, $50 an hour, $100 an hour, $330 an hour like I charge out when I charge on an hourly basis? What are you worth per hour? Take your total compensation, divide it by the number of hours you worked, and that's your value per hour. By the way, you should divide it by the number of hours you're actually working. Not the time you're driving, not the time you're goofing around, because your actual face-to-face hourly rate is much higher than what you think. It's probably $50 or $60 per hour. Then take that rate and divide by the number of introductions you get on a regular basis. So if you earn $1,000 a week on average, you're getting 20 introductions, every single introduction is worth $50 to you. Every single person who introduces you to another individual, every single one of those is $50. So every time you don't have these conversations, you don't ask, you are leaving $50 bills on the table. You wouldn't do that in a bar. You wouldn't do that in a restaurant. Why do you do that in a business meeting? Because you don't focus on it. So have this belief in your value, convey your value to a potential client, and discuss it so that you can unlock it. Next slide, please. A couple other things. Insurance is based on actuarial science. It's based on the law of large numbers. And so the one question I always ask young reps is, why isn't your business built off of the same premise as the insurance industry in general? If you are a Grantham disciple like I am, you know 10-3-1. You can quote it so your heart, right? I'm a big baseball fan, right? In baseball, to qualify for the batting title, you need to have 502 plate appearances. Okay? That's times that you get up to bat, and that number comes from 3.1 plate appearances per game that your team plays. If you don't have at least 3.1 appointments scheduled per day on average, which is 15.5 per week, you will be out of business within a year unless you're incredibly lucky. And I don't like planning my business around luck. I like to project and understand and squeeze that risk out. So looking at your business, are you having enough activity? Are you getting enough swings? Are you having enough attempts to be successful? If you do not have at least 500 appointments scheduled for the year, you probably will not be here next year. So get up to that 3.1 appointments per day, and realistically it should be 3.1 capped. Only way you're going to do that, get more introductions. Only way you're going to get more introductions, earn the right to ask and ask for it. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Diane. There we go. So one of the things that you're going to say is, well, geez, if I'm that busy, I'm going to run around like a chicken with my head cut off. I'm never going to have time to be able to do all this stuff. Make sure that you don't run out of time in your meeting and are doing the right things to always get introductions, or almost always. You should follow SOP, Standard Operating Procedures. If you don't know, I'm an engineer by background, so everything is based on SOP, building the processes, building the machine. So you can steal this first meeting agenda. It's been compliance approved by many offices. And so you can see, well, I can't see that now because my screen's blank, but you can see exactly what I would present to a potential client the first time I sat down with them. Okay, so introductions, who are we, how we got here, thanks so-and-so for getting us together. An overview of my process. This is how I do what I do. Our mutual expectations, that's where we talk about if I add value. If you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of our meeting, you feel good about what we do, will you introduce me to other individuals? And you got the rest of your stuff. And look, number 7, favorable introductions, right there on the sheet. And then expect time meetings so that they know, hey, I've only got a half hour. Okay, well, they do 1, 2, and 7 and 8. Next slide, please. There's also one that you can utilize for your presentation meeting. Got the same sort of things there. And oh, look, number 6, favorable introduction. Every single time you add value, you deserve the right for introduction. Next page, please. So it comes down to that you need to tell them that you're going to ask if you earn the right to ask for introductions, and then ask them, T-E-A. And the last part is make it simple for them because Americans tend to be lazy, and I believe that my good friend Matt is actually going to give you a couple of ways to make it very easy to ask those things. If not, we can go over that in the Q&A. Now I'll turn it over to Matt Anderson, who is very, very intelligent, really knows his stuff, and has one of the coolest accents on the planet.
All right, thank you very much, Joe. So my topic today is wording. It's 3 ways to ask for referrals, but one of the things, Joe, I'm really glad you covered, we didn't rehearse this ahead of time, so it's perhaps good fortune, but one of the things that Joe emphasized, I felt a lot, which is incredibly important because it comes before having good wording, is having your head in the right place. And so some of the things he said, such as you do too much good, you are too valuable, and have this belief in your value, that certainly has to be there before the wording comes in. And so where I'm coming in today is where the wording matters, of course, is because when you're comfortable with what you're going to say, you feel more competent, and then of course, that boosts your confidence. So next slide, please. One of the questions that I get most frequently is, how do I transition to ask for a referral when a meeting's going well? And I've got one suggestion today that will work. Well, it works if you choose to use it. So next slide, please. And you can tweak the main word I use in this particular phrase. But a number of years ago, I just started using this expression. Diane, next slide, please. Which is, it would be silly not to ask. And so after a while of having success using it myself, I started having clients use it, people in your industry, as kind of guinea pigs. And the first person that I recommended it to is a chap called Jerry, who's a Northwestern agent in Milwaukee. And he liked the sound of it. So after church that Sunday, he went up to this executive whose father owns one of the major bratwurst-making companies in Wisconsin. And he said, I know we see each other around some of the things we do with our kids, but I've never really sat down and talked too much about how I work with executives such as yourself. It would be silly if we didn't grab lunch sometime. And they had lunch, and he became a client. And so after that success story, I've started teaching it to more and more people. And the people that like it and use it get results with it. So I remember last year there was a guy in Dallas called John that was sitting at his daughter's volleyball game, and there was a lady next to him, and he sort of knew her, sort of knew she was in the financial world, but wasn't quite sure what she did at her company. And he said, Stacy, it'd be silly of me not to ask you, but who would be the person at your company that deals with the defined contribution plans? And she said, oh, that would be me. $500 million opportunity. A couple months ago, a new client of mine called Scott in Atlanta was talking with an accountant that he'd been meeting for, on and off for 3 years. She'd never referred him any business, and he said, it'd be silly of me not to ask you, who does your financial planning? And she said, oh, I do it myself, worth $1.8 million. She became a client. So if you don't like the word silly, then change it to it would be foolish of me, or it would be remiss of me, or it wouldn't make any sense if I didn't ask you about this person, this opportunity, this organization that I'd like to do a presentation for. So point being is, this is very effective wording, and I really hope you like the sound of it because it works. Next slide, please, Diane. And so once you're in that position, that you've transitioned the conversation from a meeting that's going well, where it just doesn't make any sense not to bring up the referral ask, then you're going to get to me, there's only 2 real ways to ask for what you want effectively. Diane, next slide, please. It's either a direct ask, where you just flat out say, I'd love to meet Dave. Any chance the 3 of us can get together for coffee, lunch, beer, drinks, coffee, golf, whatever the example might be. And you're probably watching this webcast thinking, Matt, this is pretty obvious. And you're right. It's just that not all of our relationships are that comfortable. And many of you on this webcast may not be direct communicators. So you might not be 100% comfortable thinking of using that wording with everyone. Next slide, please, Diane. So you might, and that's, of course, asking for the personal introduction, which Joe also mentioned, of course, was easily the best way to get business. Here's a softer way to ask that works just as well. Don't be deceived by the wording. I'd love to meet Dave, and this is my personal favorite language right now is, would you be willing to put in a good word about me to him and see if he'd be open to hearing from me sometime? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but it isn't. Because all we're talking about with any referral ask is somebody agreeing to open a door for you and then you following up on it. So I believe in 2012, the wording gets a little bit softer, but you're still getting from A to B. So that would be an option. And then next slide, Diane. And so where this goes is assuming the person says, yeah, that's fair enough. Then one of the simple common sense but not common practice mistakes that people make is they don't always keep control of this process. For example, I had this conversation last week with a client of mine called Bill in Boston, and he's doing everything right other than making sure that he has the next step as far as what to do. So he gave, there's a couple of examples he'd mentioned where this doctor, very happy with the work that he'd done, said, yeah, absolutely, I'll tell some people at work about you. And Bill said, great, thanks. And this was about 2 months ago. And then he shared another example about a divorce attorney that had mentioned a client of his that he keeps meaning to refer him to. But so the conversation I had with Bill is, use this question. Just get this person to tell you what to do. And it's kind of interesting because I also didn't know Joe was going to talk about this. But when he talked about what he called that verbal contract of people agreeing to follow through for you, he said it's psychologically binding. Well, it is. And if you don't have to believe us, it's been researched by a guy called Robert Cialdini at Arizona State. He's written books on it. His main book's called Influence. He calls it the law of commitment and consistency. And the basic premise to this is that people hate to be seen as inconsistent to what they have to say, and that's why when the old school way, of course, would have been not to ask this question, but to say, well, tell you what, I'll call this prospect tomorrow. Shall I call him in the morning or the afternoon? Shall I call him on his cell phone or his office phone? Well, that doesn't work anymore for 99% of people. You want to get the other person, at least most of the time, to tell you what to do. Again, none of this is black and white. I mean, there's times when you want to step in because you know best, but it's very effective to ask it this way. Diane, next slide, please. And then the other way to ask, because like I said, sometimes the direct ask isn't appropriate, is to ask for advice. And so, for example, I was talking to someone last Monday, actually, Greg in Cleveland, a client of mine, and he gave an example where an estate planning attorney had mentioned a client to him and said, yeah, I gave your name to this client. Again, another situation where he had no control. She didn't call him, so he went back to the attorney and he sought advice. And by the way, everybody loves to give advice. So while you think you're giving up control by doing this, you're actually getting more. And so what he said to this attorney was, well, what would you suggest I do? And you don't always know what you're going to get as a response, but usually you get a better idea from the other person, and also what they do is they take more ownership of this process. So the attorney actually suggested, I'm not saying this is a typical example in terms of his idea, but he said to the financial professional, well, you should send her a letter. However, this attorney also sent his client a letter because she hadn't finished her estate plan. Anyway, long story short, it led to business. So next slide, Diane. So here's some specific wording of things that you can jot down. And there's so many variations on this, but the gist is, what would be the best way to find out if this person would be interested, if your colleagues at work would benefit from a presentation on this? Alternatives, what would be the easiest way to find out if this person would be open to hearing from me, or might get some similar benefits from the things that we've discussed today, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. Here's some other suggestions on wording. Again, you get the impression, all of these work, you just pick stuff that sounds like it resonates best with you. Well, how would you recommend finding out if this is something that your sister might be interested in doing too? Now, of course, I can't cover everything in the time I have today. You might also want to weave in an acknowledgement to say, look, I don't know how often you talk to your sister about insurance or financial planning, but would you be willing to put in a good word with me about me, or would you be willing to see if she might be open to a conversation about this, because I work with an awful lot of people in this life situation or in this profession or something along those lines. That's another great sentence to add on, is use the word because and then give your reason. Even if the reason isn't amazing, it adds power to your statement. So I'll repeat that one more time. So it might be, I know you mentioned your sister lives nearby, and I don't know how often, if you ever talk to her about the kinds of things we've discussed, and you pause to see what kind of response you get. She says, well, but what would be probably the best way to find out if she might be interested in hearing from me? Because, and then give some kind of reason. Because it's always fun to work with people and their families, or again, if you know a little bit about the sister, she just got married, etc., whatever the life situation, or because I work with a lot of people who are business owners or who are in this line of work, etc., etc. Next slide, please, Diane. But the real point here that I'm hoping you're taking away is get people's advice. Some of the time, either directly ask, but people love to chime in. Now, why this matters, and actually I've kind of already explained some of this. The next slide, please, Diane. This does happen sometimes. I mean, it's just kind of come up in the flow. Is and I don't know if you can see the wording. There was wording on this slide. That's fine. You can leave it there, Diane. That's fine. But the reason that previous slide was basically just to say that people like to honor their word. And it's funny, because I was thinking about this before I presented today, thinking actually it's interesting. We think we live in a society where people don't trust each other. And while that may be true on certain levels, when we do business with people, it's different. And most people do want to honor what they say. And you can call people on their word. And so, for example, all those phantom referrals you've had where somebody said, yeah, I gave your name to so-and-so and you never hear it, call those people on their word and say, I jotted down an example before, like another client of mine in Atlanta called Wes. He did that. He went back to all these people that had said they'd referred them. He reminded them of when they'd said this, even if it was sort of back when we talked in April. You'd mentioned this client of yours, or you'd mentioned your brother. And then then what he would do is he'd say, well, we've got this event coming up on the 19th, or I'm going to be in town, or I'm going to be in your area, next Tuesday. Would that work as an opportunity for me to potentially meet this person? So kind of calling them on it. I mean, you might call them on something else in terms of if you need a personal introduction, you just want to be able to call them. But why it matters is based on these numbers. Came across these numbers. They're from Sandler Sales Institute many years ago, and I find them surprisingly accurate. If you just get a name of someone who is not expecting to hear from you, it only leads to business 15% of the time. But if they have okayed you getting in touch with them, it goes up to 50. So that's why it's worth getting these referrals warmed up and getting the other person, your referral source, more engaged in the process. And 80% is what Joe was talking about at the beginning. The best referrals, of course, personal introductions. Diane, that's it. If you want to put up the next slide. If you've got future questions, there's my contact info. Always happy to help, Diane. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Joe and Matt. If anyone has questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat box, and I can read them out to Joe or Matt. While we're waiting, we just have a couple minutes left during the broadcast. Matt, I'll start with you. What is one of the most typical questions you get from your clients with respect to referrals?
Well, the question that comes up the most is when's the best time to ask? And we'd need to leave probably a lot more time to get into that, because the short answer, in my opinion, and Joe may have a different response, I think the short answer is when there's water in the well. In other words, when you've brought some value such that the person sees reason in recommending you. But I acknowledge that there's a ton of gray area, because we know people that will refer us quickly, and then there's others that it takes them years before they ever refer us. But that's the most common question I get.
And actually, I agree with Matt on that. You only earn the right to ask for introductions after you have added value. So part of my planning process was always to add value everywhere I could, where it's an initial meeting, the fact finder, the presentation, through service work, all along the path, so that you always have the right to ask. The more value that you bring, the more value you deserve to derive.
We've had a number of questions about if the slides will be available and also the presentation, and the answer to that is yes. Both will be posted on the NAIFA Webinar Archive site. That's www.naifa.org/webinars. Sorry. But we'll put out an email reminder of that. Let's see. But we do have a couple other questions we'll take. What do you think? Oh, Joe, why do you think that people care about how we are compensated?
Because people don't like surprises. They like to understand as much of what's going on, even if they don't want the gory details of, oh, I get paid 2.97% on this and 3.45%. They want a general understanding. You know, they're like, how much is this going to cost me? You know, where do you make your money? I mean, literally, I would say 50% of the time, when I was working directly with clients, they'd ask me, so how do you make money? I tell them, you know, if we find a product, that's the appropriate thing. But basically, I'm asking you to substitute for a marketing department. So I don't need to have $200,000 worth of overhead. It's much more efficient and effective for me to work on an introductory basis. And it's just so much more effective, because if we sit down and I bring a lot of value to you, you understand a little bit more about the process that I take my clients through and the value that I can bring. And you understand the people in your universe's situation a little bit, not necessarily intimately, but somewhat. And so you can say, yeah, so-and-so, they might look like they're a great potential person for you to talk to, they're worth a lot of money, but they're an absolute jerk. I don't want to talk to that person. But you can also say, you know, that guy over there, he doesn't seem like much, but he's a really quality guy, loves his family. Oh, and by the way, you know, he's got some things coming down the road where he could use a little bit of extra guidance. So I can help their friends, which then further strengthens their relationship and makes them look like a hero.
Okay, and then we're also getting questions for the contact information for each of you. It's in the slides as well as some of the other finer points of the presentation. But Joe, could you just remind people how they can reach you if they're seeking to talk to you more?
Sure. My email is headgeek@unique-minds.com. That's headgeek, H-E-A-D, geek, @unique-minds.com. I'm also on Twitter, or you can just Google search Joe Templin and you'll probably find me.
And Matt, what about you?
Yeah, well, Googling my name doesn't work very well because there's a million Matt Andersons, unfortunately. But yeah, my website's thereferralauthority.com, thereferralauthority.com. My email, matt@thereferralauthority.com.
Okay, and I don't see any other questions. Any parting words from Joe or Matt?
Matt, you want to go first, or do you want me to take this one?
Sure. Actually, I'll end where you started, which is the best advice is what Joe said at the beginning, is take 1 or 2 of these ideas and implement them in the next 24 to 48 hours. Otherwise, we've all wasted our time. Sorry.
And what I'm going to tell you is one of the things that I think Matt brought up is use language that is yours. I'm a big-time nerd, so I use phrases like nonlinear growth and things like that all the time. That's probably not appropriate for you guys. But there were a couple of phrases that we utilized today, a couple of ways of approaching getting introductions, things that you can do that fit naturally for you. Feel the ones that work for you and reject everything else.
All right, well, thanks both to Joe and Matt and to all who participated in today's program. Again, to access the presentation and the PowerPoints, go to www.naifa.org/webinars. It should be posted by the end of the week. This is Diane Powers for NAIFA. Have a great afternoon.